Hello, I made another little 3D animation passion project in Blender among other tools, and I learned quite a bit, so I thought I would share. First up is concept. Now I can't really remember how I came up with this concept, but I do like tea and I was feeling quite frustrated at the time, so that could explain some of it. The key poses were drawn in Procreate, starting quite loose and sketchy to try and keep the frantic expressions. Then I refined it further by inking and colouring. Not really necessary, but I enjoy that process. Sculpting. In an effort to keep the flexibility, and again because it is fun, I moved on to sculpting, staying on the iPad with Nomad Sculpt. It's worth noting at this point I had no idea how I was going to rig the character. In the past I've taken sculpt poses directly into Blender, swapping out meshes with geometry nodes, but I wanted to try something different. And I have long been inspired by Olof Berman's super flexible and awesome rigs and wanted to push myself to problem solve something similar. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Onto modeling. I imported the concept sketch and sculpt as a guide and then started as best I could in what I would describe as modeling and rigging at the same time. Building up modifiers and constraints, setting up IK limbs that stuck on to the mug body via shrink wrap for the bones and mesh, which was restricted by a vertex group, and the normals were transferred from the mug to the arms, to the limbs, with that same vertex group masking, so they could slide all over the place. The eyes were simple spheres with cup or half sphere eyelids, nested in lattice deformers so they can squash and stretch nicely. And an adjustable pupil was stuck on top, as were the eyebrows, but they were shrink wrapped to the main mug and controlled by bones. Solidify and subsurface modifiers were used heavily to keep the smooth lines and constant thicknesses, even when there are lots of deforms with bones and lattices. Onto the mouth, and I am really proud of this one. The mouth is formed by splitting the cup into, I guess, like a head and jaw, and there is a bone per vertex along the edge of that cut, and that is all wrapped to a proxy cylinder that deforms along with the mug. There's also a simple geometry node setup, so when the vertex of that edge of the mouth gets really close together, they will just fuse together. This gives the flexibility of really nice sort of like smaller ooh shapes, and then, you know, the massive super wide mouth as the mugbot screams. Materials. Materials were pretty simple. A noise texture was used to break up some of the specular by piping it into the roughness input. A layer weight fall off was used for the eyes, so it darkens the diffuse on the glancing angles. This really makes the highlights of the eyes pop nicely, which I think was quite cool. There's also a few frames where I painted on some bloodshot veins with a image texture and UVs. The tea bag was a photo of a tea bag. The only thing of note, I suppose, is that I used the Android Open Camera app to take bracketed raw exposures and then merged it into an HDR image, which was, for the time it was on screen, very overkill, but I've been getting into mobile photography recently, so much so I set up a second YouTube channel, link in description if you're interested. I designed a little tea bag label as well in Affinity Designer and exported it as a PNG to Blender. Editor Louis here from the future, and I stand corrected, whereas I would normally have done this in Affinity Designer, I actually seem to have done it in Blender itself, mainly built up of curves, grease pencil objects, text, and the odd lattice to create some nice distortion. The only thing I had real difficulty with was the flushed cheeks. I originally used object coordinates, which were empty, sort of parented to nearby bones. This along with a gradient spherical fall-off, meant that the texture could flow over the arms, over the eyelids, over the eye bags, as well as the mug. But then when I actually brought it in to the environment via instancing and scaled it down, all of these object coordinates messed up, which I guess is sort of like a cautionary tale for not modeling at the right scale to start with. So ultimately the fix was within geometry nodes using a radial, basically creating a radial vertex map based on the distance to those original empties, which then gets passed onto the shader, and then this worked when scaling down to the right scale in the environment. Speaking of environment, I'd like to say I model everything, but I basically utilized BlenderKit to populate the scene. I put together some references first and found objects that best match that vision, including plenty of small lights in the out of focus background that causes that really nice bokeh ball effect. I also changed a few colors to balance out the scene a bit with some complementary accent color. The scene is supposed to be calm and relaxed, but the mug's experience within it is anything but. Lighting. Mainly area lights, a key light or lights, being a large circle and a slightly smaller circle area light within it, for a soft light, but then it's that slightly smaller one as a stronger catch light. Then a fill light to bring up the shadows a little bit, and a rim light that is motivated by various warm practical lights in the background. There's also a sun lamp in there, which I was experimenting with, having a strong sun pour through the window and hit the back objects. But in the end, I found it a little bit too distracting, so I rotated it around a little bit, and it helped fill some of the ambience in the room. There's also some negative fill from behind the camera, basically a huge black rectangle to remove some of that ambient light and increase the contrast a little bit. Animation. Animation started out as a pencil test. I recorded the scratch audio and used a cool iPad app called Toon Squid. Really clean, minimal UI, I really like it. The same could easily be done in Grease Pencil, but I just chose to stick with the iPad for this one. The pencil test was brought into Blender via an MP4 video, loaded into the sequencer and used as a reference so I could block out the character poses to match. The poses were very much to camera, so they look a bit wonky if you move the camera, say, away from that hero position. After I felt like I hit the poses, I jumped into the graph editor for the in-betweening, adding inertia, a little bit of squash and stretch with the lattices I set up around the eyes and for the whole mug. I was getting a bit carried away with the bounciness and had to calm it down a little bit by using the smooth operation in the graph editor. Effects. I bought Embergen a while back for another job and I've been looking for an excuse to use it, and this was the perfect opportunity. I started by exporting the T-surface plane and a mug occlusion object. The plane was FBX and the occlusion mug, just so the steam didn't sort of flow over the walls of the mug, was exported as an Alembic file to hold the deformation data per frame in the vertices. It took me a while to get the Alembic file exported, as I didn't realize that if you hide it from the render, it does not export. It basically honors that setting. Switching over the export to the viewport fixed the export and it came in perfectly. Then it was just a case of tweaking all the settings in Embergen, which is cool and it is real time. I had some issues that I ran into because of the 60 Hz default nature of the animation. My animation was 24 frames per second from Blender, but I ended up running this sim at 72 Hz and then exporting every third frame back to Blender via the slice option. It imported nicely as a VDB sequence, and it's using a basic printable volume material. I did try the LiquidGen app as well, but I couldn't get it looking right, so I lent on a technique I used in the past with basically a deforming tube displacing along the normals or in geometry nodes and offsetting via the generated UVs in one axis to make it look like the water is pouring. Then I added a gradient to the shader set up to act as a kind of alpha mask and animated the tube diameter to look like the pouring starts and stops. The Screen Spit was a particle sim, again created in geometry nodes with a simulation zone, continuously creating points at different seed positions on a proxy mesh and then moving them per frame. The T-label also had a tiny little bit of cloth sim to loosen up the action a little bit. Compositing. For the compositing, I added some glare nodes, a bloom for a little bit of soft glow and some streaks for a little bit of aperture flare. I did do some of the grading in Blender's Compositor 2 after converting the raw linear to AGX sRGB, but as you can see I ended up muting those because I wanted to play around a little bit more in DaVinci Resolve. Sound. So I had already recorded the voice for the character, and I recorded a few more environmental sounds as well as sourcing some Creative Commons 0 sounds from freesound.org. And then I brought everything into Cubase and used EQ to balance the frequencies, so there isn't, for example, lots of low frequency buildup, and the audio doesn't sound like it's overlapping too much. Then I added an effects channel with 100% reverb that mimics the kind of room that the animation exists in, and then sent percentages of the various tracks over to that reverb to add to the general sense that they are in a room. And then a little bit of compression at the end of the chain just to glue all of the tracks together and tame some of those peaks. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the result. I kind of wish I got the liquid sims working, but I started not to enjoy it much, and for all of 10 seconds that the animation ended up being, it felt like perhaps it was a little bit overkill. I do feel like I could have done a few more passes of animation, perhaps retiming things a little bit, adding a bit more rest between beats. I also thought it would be fun to video the out of focus background to have some real ambient movement of people and plants and stuff, or even just do a VFX comp, similar to a CG Boost tutorial I recorded a while back. My biggest takeaway has been damn, Imogen is good and fun. I tried similar effects in Blender, and I'm sure it is possible, but it just takes so long. Also, tiny milestones. I paused on this project for ages. I basically had everything ready to go, but the animation, and just stopped. And I love animating. I was able to get myself going again by having the next step, just setting up a few poses rather than like finishing the whole animation. Anyway, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope some of it was helpful or at least a little bit interesting. If you do happen to be a Blender beginner, then extra thanks, I guess, for sitting through all of this. I've also released a new free course over on CG Boost that you might be interested in, which is a step-by-step of building this little frog bot from scratch. I promise it is not as messy as this making of.